This is Unsung History, the podcast where we discuss people and events in American history that haven't always received a lot of attention. I'm your host, Kelly Therese Pollock. I'll start each episode with a brief introduction to the topic, and then talk to someone who knows a lot more than I do. Be sure to subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app so you never miss an episode. And please, tell your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, maybe even strangers to listen to. Today, we're discussing labor and immigrant rights activist Bert Corona. Umberto Noé Corona was born on May 29, 1918, in El Paso, Texas. His parents were Mexican immigrants. His father, Noé Corona, had fought in the Mexican Revolution. In the United States, Noé Corona continued his involvement in revolutionary activities. The family briefly returned to Mexico in 1922, but when Noé was murdered, possibly by the president's forces, Bert and his family returned to El Paso. Bert's mother, Margarita, pulled him out of public school in the 4th grade when she was frustrated with the treatment of Mexican kids who were punished for speaking Spanish. At the Harwood Boys' School in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Corona organized what he later called his first strike, when he and other boys refused to attend classes until their demand was met that students no longer be spanked for questioning their teachers. Corona returned to El Paso for high school, where he became a basketball star and won an athletic scholarship to the University of Southern California. In 1936, having an athletic scholarship meant that Corona was recommended for a job where he could work nearly full-time while in college. In his case, the employment was at the Brunswick Pharmaceutical Company, and it was there that Corona found something that interested him more than basketball, as he became involved in the labor struggle. When the Longshoremen's Union wanted to organize farm workers in Orange County, Corona volunteered to help. He recruited union members and, in 1936, led 2,500 Mexican-American and Mexican workers in a strike. Having found his calling in the labor movement, Corona left college and took a job as a union organizer with the Congress of Industrial Organizers, or CIO, where he organized workers in the canning and packing industries. In August 1941, Corona eloped and married a Jewish-American labor organizer named Blanche Taff. When the U.S. entered World War II, Corona volunteered for the Army Air Corps. When he was done with basic training and officer training, during which he witnessed racial discrimination, Corona went to California for flight training and worked 16-hour days, both training and in clerical work. In California, Corona was given a psychiatric evaluation designed to root out so-called deviants. And then he went through rounds of interrogation as officers questioned his political activities. With no explanation, Corona was dismissed from the Air Corps and assigned to mailroom duty in an Army hospital. He later trained as a paratrooper. Just before he was set to deploy overseas, he requested a pass to go to Atlanta. The pass was issued, but improperly, which Corona later felt was purposeful. And as a result, he was locked in a federal prison for 45 days without pay while his unit shipped out. After World War II, Corona returned his attention to the plight of Mexican Americans and undocumented Mexican immigrants. He joined forces with union leaders Phil and Albert Usquiano to found La Hermandad Mexicana Nacional, or the Mexican National Brotherhood, to support immigrants and organize workers in San Diego. In 1968, Corona co-founded Centro de Acción Social Autónomo, or CASA, with Soledad Chloe Alatorre. CASA provided practical help to Mexican immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, by teaching classes on reading and writing in English, along with history and driving courses. CASA, as a community-based organization, acted much like earlier Mexican mutual aid societies. But CASA also had another goal: to help convince Mexican Americans to support undocumented immigrants, and to show that they were one people who should join forces in their labor and social efforts. In 1974, Corona worked with immigrant rights activist and Catholic priest Mark Day to write the Charter of Rights for Immigrant Workers, also called the Immigrant Bill of Rights, that they presented to the United Nations. In the document, they argued that immigrants had, as human rights, the right to job security, equal pay, and access to labor unions, along with freedom from deportation and the right to unite with their families. Corona distributed the document widely, which helped to shift the opinions of Mexican Americans toward support of the undocumented. Corona had left college before earning his degree, but his life experience was so valued that he lectured at colleges, including at Stanford and at several Cal State campuses. Teaching at Cal State Los Angeles in the 1970s and 80s, Corona led a group of adjuncts who were pushing for social activism to be part of the mission of the Chicano Studies Department. Corona and others were fired by the college in the wake of their agitating. Blanche Taff, Corona's first wife and the mother of his 3 children, died in 1993. Corona later remarried to activist Angelina Castillo. In the book Memories of Chicano History, which was a collaboration between Corona and historian Mario Garcia, Corona says, quote, "Frankly, I never concerned myself with a place in history. I've been busy organizing and working with others. If my life has meant anything, I would say that it shows you can organize workers and poor people if you work hard, are persistent, remain optimistic, and reach out to involve as many people as possible." Unquote. Joining me now to help us learn more about the life of Bert Corona is Dr. Eladio B. Bobadilla, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Kentucky, whose 2019 dissertation is entitled "One People Without Borders: The Lost Roots of the Immigrants' Rights Movement, 1954 to 2006. Hello, Eladio. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Kelly. I'd love to talk about my research. I'm happy to be here.
Yes. So it's super exciting to talk to you. We've known each other over Twitter for a while, so it's always good to actually get to talk to people about their research. I wanted to start by asking you, your dissertation is about immigrants' rights activists, and of course, we're going to talk about Bert Corona. How did you first get into this research? What sort of inspired you?
Well, I wanted to tell the story of people that I grew up with, the story of my parents, especially of my neighbors, of everyone that I grew up with seemed to seemed to do farm work. I grew up in Delano, California, after moving to the States from Mexico in 1997. And so all I knew was this community and this community of farm workers and poor people trying to make a living. I wanted to tell their stories. And when I started to do the research, I focused on Cesar Chavez. And what I found immediately was that there was this really unsavory story about Chavez, where in the 1970s, and even before that, he was engaged in this anti-immigrant project. And I found that really bizarre because I'd always thought of Cesar Chavez as this patron saint of brown people, of all brown people. And I realized that there was a larger story here, that there was a story of Mexican Americans who weren't always pro-immigrant and who actually had to come to that position by way of this long struggle, intellectual and labor and personal struggle. And so that's the story I ended up telling, is this shift from that moment, and really before that. I mean, Cesar Chavez was not the first to have these anti-immigrant positions, and that's the story again I ended up telling, is how we got from that to today, to how we often think about Mexican Americans and their views, which are typically pro-immigrant, not always, even today. But, again, I wanted to sort of tell the story of folks like my parents, and it became a bigger story about the immigrants' rights struggle and how it became a movement.
Yeah. Yeah. And I should mention, it's a great dissertation. I've read it. I'm one of those people that reads dissertations for fun.
Oh goodness. I don't think I've read my own dissertation just out of pure fear and panic about all everything that's wrong with it, but I'm glad someone read it.
Yes, well, it's very good.
Thank you.
So I want to come back some to this story of the shift, but let's talk a little bit about Bert Corona and what are the types of things that we have from him. So a lot of people have probably just not even heard of him at all, or maybe only in passing. But we have a lot of material about him. So what are the kinds of the records and the archives that we have to know about his life?
So the records that really tell his story are primarily at Stanford University, where the records of the organization that he came to be associated with, that he founded, CASA, the Centro de Acción Social Autónomo, or Center for Autonomous Social Justice, right? That he built from the ground up in the 1960s. And there's also a great deal of material in this phenomenal collection that is all digitized, based in San Diego. I think the University of California, San Diego, the Herman Baca papers. And Herman Baca was his mentee. He became sort of the person who took up his mantle after he passed. And well before that, they were working together. So there's just an immense there's a treasure trove of documents that are available online that I use all the time to teach about immigrants' rights. And I'll always plug that, because if anyone's interested in teaching using primary sources to teach, you can find some amazing stuff online at the Herman Baca collection.
Excellent. So Bert Corona himself, it seems like his family life is fairly foundational to sort of who he is, who he becomes. Could you talk a little bit about sort of, where he's coming from as he's entering this immigrants' rights space?
Yeah, I mean, he was always, I think, destined to become who he became. He was the son of a revolutionary. During the Mexican Revolution, his father fought alongside Pancho Villa. He came from a working class family right on the border. Grew up in El Paso. Eventually, he moves to California and sees the immigrant struggle there. But for him, I mean, I think this radical tradition was instilled on him. It was instilled into him very early on in his life. And he always looked for ways to improve the lives of people like his parents, right? I talked about how I wanted to tell the story of my parents. I think so many of us are shaped by our upbringing in really fundamental and foundational ways. And you can really see that in his life. I think he saw the suffering of people like his parents, like his community's suffering, and wanted in some ways, I think, to carry on that revolutionary tradition. He did it in a different way, but I still find it odd that so few people understand how foundational he is to Mexican American identity and specifically to the immigrants' rights movement, because he is, as many of us, will say, the father of the immigrants' rights movement.
And you mentioned Cesar Chavez earlier. There's such an interesting connection there then between work and labor and immigration. So I wonder if you could talk through that a little bit, why it was that Chavez was anti-immigrant and how sort of Bert Corona approached that differently and saw things in a different way.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really important to take a nuanced approach to Chavez and his position on immigration, because it made a great deal of sense. Frankly, I mean, there were immigrants, a huge number of immigrants in the Central Valley, where he was trying to make something out of this movement that he and other farm workers began in the late '60s, and it was making it really difficult for them to organize and to win their strikes when employers could simply look to the border or just to the fields where other immigrants were eager to take the work, right? And break those strikes. So it made a degree of sense for Chavez to say, we can't win without taking the stance. Immigration was a real issue, and it was, depressing wages. It was making it difficult for the union to win its strikes. So it's not like Chavez was just some xenophobic, anti-immigrant isn't even really, I think, entirely fair. I think his positions seem to a lot of people to be anti-immigrant. He would have framed them as anti-scab, right? But Bert Corona saw things differently, and he thought that these immigrants, these undocumented people, could, instead of being detrimental to the union, that they could be essential in winning these strikes, that they could be won over, and that they could be convinced to take part in this movement. And so he articulated this position over and over again, and eventually helped shift that position. I mean, Chavez did ultimately shift his views on immigration, partly because of all this pressure, partly because he understood that it just wasn't working the way he was trying to do things, that immigrants were going to be there regardless, and that at some point he was, sort of fighting the same people that his union ostensibly represented. But I credit Corona with much of that shift, certainly with Chavez's own personal shift and his own views, but more importantly, with the larger shift that we see across Mexican American groups and individuals and the entire Mexican American community, which for a time, much like Chavez, felt deeply ambivalent about immigration, if not outwardly hostile. And sometimes they were very hostile. And by the 1970s, that position has changed completely. I mean, there are still people who are anxious about immigration. There are still people today who are Mexican American and who feel anxious about immigration. But that was a minority by the 1970s. It was a very, very quick shift. And Bert Corona is central to that story.
And Bert Corona and Chavez had actual conversation or relationship. What did that look like?
Well, it was always friendly. I mean, they were friends. They considered each other allies, friends, comrades. So it was always positive, and I think that's part of what shifted Chavez's attitude. So there were a lot of people, not just Corona, reaching out to Chavez and saying this is nonsense. This is a mistake. Mm-hmm. Some were very harsh and said, "You are betraying the movement. This movement you created, you are breaking it. You're destroying your own movement, and you're hurting the people that you are supposed to be representing." And there was a lot of anger and a lot of rage and a lot of disappointment. Bert Corona was much more diplomatic in his approach and in his letters to Chavez and his communication with Chavez. He always started with, I see where you're going through, and I see what the movement is facing, and I know this is difficult, but let's look at this in a different way. And that really seemed to be what Chavez responded to. Now, Chavez had a dark side, and by the middle of the 1970s, that dark side was taking over, and any sort of criticism was almost counterproductive. to make anything change, he would just become extremely defensive, and it wasn't working. Bert Corona, I think, was really a people person, understood who he was talking to and how he needed to be approached, and ultimately did help shift those attitudes in Chavez himself, and then in the larger movement.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I find so interesting, and of course I've looked at this in different groups as I've done these series of episodes, is that you mentioned this shift in the attitude among Mexican Americans toward immigration, but it's also almost a shift in how they view themselves as a group, sort of who is this group that we belong to. And then it continues, of course, right, to not be just Mexican Americans, but a sort of larger Latino, Hispanic kind of group. Could you talk about that shift? Because I find it so fascinating that this isn't, we look at it now and think, well, it's just sort of natural. Of course
Right.
it's that way, but it's anything but natural.
You're absolutely right. It feels natural because we live in this moment where, yeah, most Hispanics, most Latinos tend to be pretty pro-immigrant, right? And again, there are exceptions, but on the whole, we tend to associate that position with Mexican Americans and Latinos more broadly. But yeah, that wasn't always the case. And Herman Baca, whom I mentioned earlier, and who became Corona's partner in all of this and his mentee, likes to tell a story. I interviewed him a few times, and others have interviewed him, and it seems like anytime anyone asks him about this, he tells the story, and he remembers Bert Corona walking into his print shop. I think it was the 1960s, early 1960s. I'm blanking on the exact date. But Bert Corona walked into Herman Baca's print shop, and they had this conversation about the Chicano movement and how to make something of it, how to protect the Chicano community, the Mexican American community. And Corona said to Baca something along the lines of, "We have to get ahead of this immigration issue." And Baca tells me that his reaction was, "What the hell are you talking about? What does that have to do with us?" Is what he asked him. I think he says that he asked him, "Are you on peyote?" or something like that. But he was genuinely shocked that that was the answer. For Baca, those were two separate issues. Immigration was one issue, and the status and the challenges that Mexican Americans faced was a totally different issue. Bert Corona thought they weren't, and I think he was proven right that it became the same question. And very quickly, Baca came to understand that he was right, that immigration control was hurting Mexican Americans as well, that they were being harassed by the authorities, especially in the borderlands, but sometimes beyond, that they were often deported. I mean, U.S. citizens were being deported if they couldn't prove they were citizens, that nativists were looking to hurt people who looked like immigrants, brown people, and that these folks face discrimination on the job, right? Because they could be seen as potentially undocumented, and there were all these issues that no one seemed to be paying attention to. That Bert Corona said we must pay attention to them. We have to. This is the same struggle, and we can't really help ourselves if we don't help our undocumented brothers and sisters.
You mention in your dissertation this idea of without borders. And so I think Bert Corona talks about that. And you say that he doesn't just mean sort of physical border between Mexico and the US. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on sort of what he means by being a people without borders.
Yeah, I think it does mean a number of things. In one sense, I think he always dreamed of a world without borders. He was a radical. He was a socialist, and he imagined, he viewed borders as inherently illogical. But he also, I think, understood the limits of that idealism. And often when he spoke about this ideology, sin fronteras, without borders, I think he meant almost more a psychological state of mind, wherein the Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants saw each other and themselves as one community. And for him, that was the goal, ultimately, for people to see themselves as brothers and sisters beyond those borders. He understood that these borders existed, and his language is often idealistic, but his approach to the issue is often pragmatic. He worked to teach immigrants their rights, to teach them basic skills like driving, like reading and writing. And so I think what that meant for him more than anything else was that communities north and south of the border would see themselves and each other as fighting the same battles.
Just started talking a little bit about teaching immigrants about their rights, and you mentioned CASA earlier. I wonder if you could talk some about CASA, what this organization was, why it was important.
Sure. Yeah. So CASA was founded in 1968. So Bert Corona and Soledad de la Torre, who was a key partner for him, built this organization. The name is no coincidence. Casa means home in Spanish, and he and La Torre saw it as a kind of base for Mexican immigrants in Southern California, where they could learn about their basic rights, where they could learn about labor rights, where they could pick up basic skills. So that was the kind of practical side of CASA. I think it was also an ideological center. It was a communication center, right, where people drafted statements that then were distributed, where people could come and organize and float ideas and think about ways to help Mexican American and Mexican immigrants protect their rights and each other's rights. Out of this place comes the Immigrants Bill of Rights, or the Charter of Rights, that Mark Day, then a Catholic priest, he has since left the church. I think the church. He certainly left the priest, but he's a fascinating figure himself, and he doesn't get any credit for all of this. But he's central to this movement. But this Charter of Rights, it is a manifesto. Really, it has no legal basis, obviously, but it essentially says what modern activists have been saying, that there is no such thing as illegal people, that human beings cannot be illegal, that they are human beings with human rights. And again, this doesn't have any sort of legal force, but it creates a profoundly important ideology, and it helps spread this idea and this message that very quickly is picked up by Chicanos and Chicanas, people who are beaming with ethnic pride, and suddenly they understand that immigration is part of the story, and that's part of their own struggle as well.
I think it's important, and it seems like CASA is starting to get into this, to understand. You started this whole story with talking about farmers and how you were looking at farming, but that Bert Corona was interested not just in Mexican Americans and immigrants on the farm and in the rural areas, but in cities and urban areas. Yeah. And that seems like a really important point to make, because I think it's still the case that people think, sort of especially migrant farm workers, that's sort of the picture they have of Mexican immigration. So could you talk a little bit about that sort of urban immigrant piece and what that meant?
Yeah, here again, I think Bert Corona was prophetic. I think he understood that demographics, of course, were changing, but also migration patterns were changing greatly. So all this focus in the 1960s and early 70s was on the fields, on Central California specifically, and certainly that's where the farm worker movement began, and in some ways these questions really took off. But more and more people were moving to cities, and immigrants, more and more undocumented immigrants are moving to cities, places like San Diego, of course, Los Angeles, Chicago. And Bert Corona understood that and thought that there needed to be, of course, a focus on the farm worker struggle, but that it also had to be zoomed out and thought of as a larger movement, and the cities were critical. And in fact, even the people we might call migrant farm workers were becoming less migrant and less attached to the fields. So today, for example, when I visit Delano, California, or the Central Valley generally, and I talk to farm workers, they live in the cities. They live in places like Delano and Bakersfield and Tulare. They may work in agriculture and in the fields, but they're not really migrant in any real sense anymore. So things were changing, and Bert Corona saw that and thought that the cities were where much of this organizing was going to be happening. And he was right. I mean, today, that is where most immigrants' rights organizing is taking place.
Yeah. So I want to jump backwards in time for a minute before jumping forwards in time. And the backwards in time piece is that Bert Corona in World War II, I think. So he joins the military, or tries to join the military, and runs into this really quite discriminatory situation. And so I wonder if you could talk about that. And I know that you also have a military background. So I wonder, if you could sort of talk it all, have things changed? I hope. What did that look like for Bert Corona versus what that might look like now?
Yeah, so Bert Corona faced discrimination in the military like most Mexican Americans and most people of color did in World War II and in that era. I think he was disillusioned with a lot of what he saw. He was made to feel like an outsider, which I think helped him understand the plight of the undocumented, and again to come to this conclusion that like them, Mexican Americans faced discrimination and racism and class prejudices and exploitation. Yeah, so certainly things have changed. I think today's military is obviously much more diverse, much more attuned to the changing demographics and values of this country. I think the worst thing that I suffered, and I tell the story, and some people find it amusing, some find it horrifying, but for a time, because you can join the military if you're not a citizen, as long as you have a green card, and that was my situation. And all of us who were not citizens yet, we were given emails like everyone else, but we were also given a country code that had to be attached to the email. So it was like my first name dot last .mx, right, at navy.mil, and people from the Philippines, it was like .pi and so on. And it was this, I remember at the time feeling really just awful by that, because here I am serving the U.S. military. I'm doing what everybody else is doing, but I was, literally marked with this foreign label. And I guess that's what we might call like a microaggression now these days, right? I didn't have a word for it, but I knew it felt weird and odd, and I don't think they do that anymore. But certainly that's nothing compared to the kinds of things that people suffered in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and then through 70s and around that time. But things have changed. Things are changing. The military is much more diverse. Again, I think the leadership is learning to work with that increasing diversity. The military these days likes to talk about diversity and inclusion, just like universities and others do. And just like universities and other organizations, they often fail to actually make something of that rhetoric. I'm sure you've seen the problems that the academies, for example, are facing with sexual assault, with sexual violence generally in the military. There are still instances of racism and discrimination, but certainly things have gotten somewhat better in some ways.
Yeah. So one of the things that you wrote about in your dissertation that I knew really nothing about, and despite the fact that I look at a lot of immigration history, is this 1986 law. I forget exactly what it's called, but the bipartisan support signed by Reagan that's looking at immigration and is trying to sort of make everybody happy and makes nobody happy as it's trying to do it. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and sort of the long-term impact that has had.
Yeah, this story really begins in the 1960s when the Brazil program ends and really picks up in the 1970s, when it no longer is just a story of the Southwest or about the Southwest. Before, immigration largely is confined, or questions about immigration are largely confined to the Southwest. By the 70s, it's a national story. And there's this nativist panic happening about the rising numbers of undocumented immigrants. By the 80s, it's clear that everyone wants to do something about it. But by the 1980s, we have all of these factions, too, that have developed. We have a really robust immigrants' rights movement led by people like Bert Corona and Herman Baca. We have a nativist lobby that is headed by organizations like FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. You have labor groups that don't quite know what to make of it. And you have employers who actually want more, more migration and easier access. And so it's this mess that at least the policy, and in terms of policy, it's a mess. No one seems to know what to do with it. Everyone wants to fix it, but what fixing it means, means something different to everyone. And eventually we get this law that is passed in 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and signed by Reagan. And it as I detail in the dissertation, it's messy. It seems like this piece of legislation seems to be dead several times, but somehow all this bipartisan maneuvering gets it passed. And it does essentially three things. It provides amnesty for initially about 1 million, ultimately about 3 million, mostly men who are in the country without documents. It also hardens the border, so it begins to militarize it. And it creates this guest worker program. And so the idea is that you give something to everyone. The flip side of that is that it gives something to everyone. And someone's always angry about what the other groups got. What I think is important about this law is that, well, first, it's precisely what we might call comprehensive immigration reform, which we always hear about. This really was comprehensive in the sense that it did a lot of everything, right? It tackled every aspect of immigration, labor, ethnicity, and immigrants' rights. It just tried to do everything. And its strength was also its weakness. By doing that, it didn't satisfy any one group. And so I think what's happened since then is that anytime we bring up this phrase or this policy goal of comprehensive immigration reform, someone will always point to 86 and say, we can't do that because it failed. We can't do that again. We can't give amnesty to immigrants because then more will just keep coming and want more amnesty. The other side might say we can't do this because it's just going to make the border more dangerous. So it has really kind of deadlocked us in this conversation. And I actually think that it was a brilliant law. I mean, there are things I hate about it as an activist, as someone who cares about immigrants' rights. I don't like a lot of what it did in terms of militarizing the border, but in terms of realistic policy and what can be accomplished, I think it was quite the achievement. And it's just looking back at it, I realized how difficult it was to get that legislation passed, and also how difficult it will be to get anything passed that resembles that in the future. I think it was such an important law and such a monumental achievement, but also it kind of made everyone angry, and now it seems like we'll never be able to do that again. Like to really sit down and look at different factions and different aspects and come up with comprehensive solutions. I think at the time people really saw immigration as this dynamic developing story. And it wasn't meant to fix immigration. This was meant to address immigration in that moment. And I think that was really what was most brilliant about it, is that people looked at what was happening in the moment and figured out a way to create fairly comprehensive legislation that addressed every aspect of the issue. And now people see it differently, right? They see it as this thing that was supposed to fix immigration problems and didn't, and it failed. So everyone thinks of it as a failure. I actually think it was a monumental success at doing at least what it intended to do in that moment.
Yeah, it's thinking from the perspective of today's politics, the idea that two parties could come together on anything is rather mind-blowing.
And not just the two parties, but all the factions, right, around it. And yeah, it happened in 1986, and it hasn't happened since. And I don't know if it will happen again.
Yeah. I guess I just wonder if you could reflect a little bit on what you started this project thinking about your family and wanting to study people like your parents and your neighbors. What going through doing this research sort of meant for you personally, sort of what all of that helped you sort of think about the family and the neighbors and all of that, and maybe reflect on, we know that history and academia don't happen in a vacuum, but I think it's something people don't always talk about. So, what it means to have that sort of personal relationship with the subject.
I found this really healing for a number of reasons. I grew up in central Mexico in Zacatecas, and we were extremely poor. We lived in an adobe house with no indoor plumbing, for a time with no electricity. We had next to nothing, and we survived because my dad would come to the States and work here seasonally. That also meant that he was gone, 6-9 months out of the year. And for a little kid, it's so hard to see your father leave every year and not know if he's going to come back, and not knowing if he's going to be okay. And when I was 11 years old, my dad came back and told us we were moving as a family, my mom and my sister, to the States. And that changed everything, right? Just because I wanted to have a more stable family, and I wanted to be with my parents, both of them. So when we moved to the States, life changed drastically for me, but I also was undocumented, and I didn't actually get my green card until I was 19 years old, which is when I joined the Navy. So putting together this dissertation, now this book manuscript, has really helped me work through some of those issues of identity, right? And figure out where I really belong, where I come from, and where what I've sort of made of my own identity. And I've realized that it's not that uncommon, right? For people like me, for immigrants, or even for first, second generation children of immigrants, to wrestle with this question of identity, about who they are. And I think you see that actually in the subjects that I write about. They're trying to work out who they are. Are they Mexican? Are they American? Are they Mexican American? And if so, what does that mean? And that changes. It's never static, right? For people in the 1950s, it meant one thing. For people in the 60s and 70s during the Chicano movement, it meant something else entirely. That is changing again, right? We're even wrestling with the language again, whether Latinx or Latinx works better, or if we should say Latine, or if we should stick to Latino, Latina. There are all these questions about identity happening all the time, and I think it's benefited me to be explicit about my own place in this story, as someone who is an immigrant, the child of farm workers, an immigrant myself, someone who came from Delano, California, where the drama of the farm workers movement took place. I have really leaned into that, and for a time I was really self-conscious about it, and thought that maybe that wouldn't be received well. But I think it matters. I think it matters that we be honest with ourselves and where we fit in the stories we tell. And I've tried to do that. I try to do that in my own teaching, to tell my students where I come from and why these stories matter to me. And I hope it's received well. I hope people find it to be as important as I do. And I think there will be some lessons in there for activists, for historians, for students. But yeah, this is my story in a sense, and it's also a story that is relevant to millions of people. So I hope that it resonates with them, and I hope that it tells some version of the immigrant story and also the larger American story.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I always like when I get to see sort of who scholars are, not just their research, but who they are. And you can't help but be affected by who you are. And so I think being so open and honest about that is really, really great. All right. So on a lighter note, my last question for you. You're known on Twitter for your food takes, and
Wow.
you grew up in Mexico. So I want to know, what's the best Mexican food?
Oh, you're really putting me on the spot. Like the best dish?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. Camarones a la diabla, like deviled shrimp. It's something that my mom used to make for me as comfort food, and that I have yet to perfect, and I'm working on it, and one day I will. But nothing makes me as happy as camarones a la diabla. Just, it makes me think of my mother and all the wonderful moments we shared together, and so I always think of her and how happy made her to make me happy with that dish. So that's always going to be the closest to my heart.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Was there anything else you wanted to make sure we mention about Bert Corona?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that, yes and no. I mean, that I could talk about him for hours, but I think we got to the heart of who he is and what matters. I guess I would just say that I find it odd that so little is known about him. Mm-hmm. Everyone knows about Cesar Chavez, and we should. He's an important story, both because of what he accomplished and where he failed, and his limits, and because he was in a sense a saint, and then also had his own demons. I mean, he's a fascinating person, and maybe that's what we know so much about him. But Bert Corona, I think, is just as important to the story of Mexican Americans, of the Southwest, of labor history. I think he's a critical figure that we don't pay enough attention to, and I hope to start to change that. I mean, some people have written about this recently, and I hope to really advance that story. But Bert Corona is essential to our history. It's essential to America. He's essential to American history. He's certainly essential to Latinx history, and he's a huge part of 20th century labor history as well. So I hope more people learn more about him in the future.
Well, I'm so grateful to you for sharing your information about him, because I'm excited to have learned about him.
Thank you.
And if people want to follow you so they know when your book comes out, so they can read all this super fascinating history, how can they follow you?
I'm on Twitter, probably too much.
We all are.
Yeah, that's true. E_B_ Bobadilla, Bobadilla.
Excellent. I'll put a link in the show notes for that.
Oh, wonderful. So, thank you.
Eladio, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thanks for listening to Unsung History. You can find the sources used for this episode at unsunghistorypodcast.com. To the best of our knowledge, all audio and images used by Unsung History are in the public domain or are used with permission. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at unsung__history or on Facebook at Unsung History Podcast. To contact us with questions or episode suggestions, please email Kelly at unsunghistorypodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review and tell your friends.